You're listening to the Sex and Psychology Podcast, the sex ed you never got in school and won't get anywhere else. I am your host, Dr. Justin Lehmiller. I am a social psychologist and research fellow at the Kinsey Institute and author of the book, Tell Me What You Want, The Science of Sexual Desire and How It Can Help You Improve Your Sex Life. In the previous episode, we talked about the most common reasons people report for sharing their fantasies with a partner, as well as why some people decide to keep them secret. In this show, we're going to dive deeper into the world of fantasy disclosure. Specifically, we're going to explore the factors that predict people's willingness to open up about their sexual fantasies with a partner. For example, we'll consider things like relationship satisfaction and duration. Now, you might be tempted to think that people who are in happier, longer-lasting relationships would be more inclined to share their fantasies. But is that really true? When you're really invested in a relationship and things are going super well, the stakes for sharing your fantasies can actually be even higher, because if you start sharing fantasies that your partner isn't into, you might suddenly discover sexual incompatibilities. We're also going to dive into the most common sexual fantasies and talk about how fantasy content influences fantasy disclosure. So which fantasies are people most likely to share, and which ones are they most likely to keep secret? I am joined once again by Matthew Kimberly, a lecturer in psychology at Birmingham City University. He researches sexual fantasies and also leads the Gender, Sexuality, and Intimate Relationships Research Lab. This is going to be another fascinating conversation. Stick around and we're going to jump in right after the break. Do you want to learn more from me in the form of an online or in-person course? Become Sexceptional by getting certified with Sexual Health Alliance, where you can learn from yours truly and a number of top sexuality scholars. Each year with Sexual Health Alliance, I teach courses like Fantasies Around the World, as well as immersive study abroad classes in several exciting countries. Join these programs and become a certified sexuality professional at the same time. From sex therapists to sex educators, sex coaches to sexologists, Sexual Health Alliance streamlines your path to certification while allowing you to learn from leading experts in the field. Most importantly, you'll gain the knowledge, skills, and credentials that you need to excel. Become Sexceptional and connect with world-class experts and an engaged community of sexuality professionals from all across the globe. Start your path to certification today at sexualhealthalliance.com. Okay, Matt, so let's dive further into the topic of sexual fantasies. In the last episode, we talked all about a recent study you did where you looked at people's reasons for disclosing or not disclosing their fantasies to a partner. In this episode, we're going to dig into another study you've done, which looks at how characteristics of someone's relationship predict whether they choose to share their fantasies or not. But before we get into those results, let's talk a little bit about fantasy content first. So in both of your studies, you asked people about the kinds of things that they typically fantasize about. So what are the most common kinds of fantasies that come up?
The fantasies that are kind of reported on are relatively diverse. So in the first study we talked predominantly about in the last episode, around 60% of participants reported fantasies around multiple partners or fantasies focusing on kind of elements of power exchange or pain exchange. Very similar rates reported fantasies about just trying something novel, bringing in toys into the relationship, a new location, or trying out a new position or a new act. Around 40% of participants were reporting on fantasies relating to partner sharing or non-monogamy, introducing open relationships or swinging into the relationship. And interestingly, around half indicated fantasies related to passion and romance, which I think was kind of much higher than the rates that were indicated in your research. What I'd be really interested here is kind of how you went about categorizing things based on passion, romance, novelty. So we use this kind of system where we had kind of a tick box based where participants indicated which categories they felt their fantasy fell within, which kind of led to this really diverse ranged. But in a later study, we then attempted to go through this coding process of categorizing fantasies, but actually trying to categorize something as novel or taboo if a participant hasn't explicitly said, I want to try this because it's novel or taboo, is kind of this really difficult decision.
You know, that's an interesting question about how do we categorize fantasies in the first place. And so when I did the survey for Tell Me What You Want, I asked people to describe their favorite sexual fantasy of all time in as much or as little detail as they wanted. Some people wrote a few words, some people wrote pages, some people were very elaborate in how they described their fantasies. And I had data on the fantasies of more than 4,000 people, and reading through all of those rich descriptions and trying to code all of them would have taken forever. So in the survey, I asked the follow-up question. So after people wrote out their favorite fantasy of all time, I asked them to sum up what the core theme of that fantasy is in one word, right? So what does this fantasy mean to you? And what I thought was really interesting about those one-word descriptions was that, if I read the full narrative of their fantasy, sometimes my takeaway about what the theme was totally different than the one-word description that the participant described. That's what I used as the basis for my coding was how did people distill down their favorite fantasy into a single word? And I think that made it a little easier to categorize things based on, was this really about passion and romance, or was it about something that was taboo and kind of what was going on there? So that was my process for it. Since then, I've taken other ways of approaching this. For example, after they write out their fantasy, have them complete a checklist of, what were the themes or elements that were present in this fantasy. So different ways you can go about it. And the numbers do bounce around a little bit depending on the way you ask people about their fantasies. So you found that more than half of your participants said they had a fantasy they had never shared with their partner before. And it appeared that the type of fantasy that they had was a key factor in terms of whether or not they had ever shared it. So which fantasies were people more or less likely to tell their partners about, and why? So in other words, why do we share some fantasies but not others?
Well, the most commonly reported fantasy was those involving multiple partners, and then also those involving something that was novel or adventurous. So both of these were 35% and 33% respectively, which I guess if we kind of look at sexual script theory, this concept of relationship scripts, so this kind of established almost guidebook or rules or glossary of what is expected or what occurs within the relationship. Actually, this makes sense. So if you have a relationship that doesn't already have the introduction of multiple partners within the relationship, or that kind of novel act is something that's very different to what's already present within the relationship, actually this can pose this greater risk of kind of anticipating those negative responses, particularly if this is a fantasy that's experienced quite late within the relationship or further down the line when these kind of relational scripts are really established in that sense. Those that were indicated much lower frequencies, so 10% and 15%, were those resolving around fantasies that were perceived as very passionate or romantic, or those that kind of had the flexibility of sexuality or gender expression within them, which kind of indicates either that these were experienced less frequently, which maybe anticipated is the case of kind of fantasies revolving around erotic flexibility, but fantasies revolving around passion and romance, where they were only present within 10% of undisclosed fantasies. Actually, having a fantasy around buying your partner dinner or flowers or something kind of this big sweeping romantic gestures that complies with a lot of cheesy rom-com films actually is very unlikely to have this negative response unless you're buying flowers for your partner who has really severe hay fever. Going back to this idea of, is this fantasy likely to have this negative response, or is it likely to go very well? Will my partner approve? Is it likely to lead to a change within the relationship? Is it similar to what's already happening within the relationship? Or is this big divide between current sexual behavior and what this fantasy would introduce to the relationship?
Yeah. And what you're saying there is consistent with what I've seen in my data as well, which is that, fantasies about like sex with multiple partners or opening up the relationship or doing something that's taboo, people seem less inclined to share those fantasies with a partner. And I think that makes sense because they can pose more risk to the relationship potentially. And by contrast, people are much more likely to share fantasies about things like passion and romance, right? Because as you said, there's less risk of things going wrong there. And those are also fantasies where your partner is a central part of that fantasy, making it somewhat different from, say, the non-monogamy or group sex fantasies. So that also, I think, makes it easier to share the fantasy when you can say, hey, there's this thing that I was thinking about both of us doing together, right? Which is different from a fantasy about, hey, I think it would be really hot to bring somebody else into bed with us, right? There's differences in the way that's going to be perceived in a lot of relationships. And that's why when I talk a lot about sharing fantasies with a partner, it takes a lot of care and effort in framing to make sure that you're validating your partner when you share your fantasies. Because when it's perceived as something that is, oh, you're not happy with our sex life or you want to replace me, then it doesn't tend to go very well. Now, in terms of relationship factors that predict sexual fantasy disclosure, you found that the most consistent predictor was sexual novelty. So talk to us a little bit about that. How is being in a relationship that's characterized by high levels of sexual novelty linked to sharing fantasies?
Yeah, absolutely. So we use this kind of variable of sexual novelty as categorizing relationship that might be quite diverse. The sexual behavior within it is varied. There's frequent sexual communication. Partners might frequently suggest new aspects to their partner or might constantly be trying new things out. And actually, we found that this was a really positive predictor of disclosure. So, as sexual novelty within the relationship increased, people became more likely to share their sexual fantasy with a partner, which I guess if we're thinking back to that idea of kind of relational scripts, makes sense. If you have this kind of really diverse sexual script, actually it increases the likelihood that the fantasy that you've had is likely to be very similar to something you've already tried or can at least build on it. So I think in the last episode, you mentioned this idea of almost disclosure scaffolding. So starting off with very kind of lower risk disclosures and then kind of building up to those that may pose more of a threat. And actually, if the relationship's characterized by high sexual novelty, you can almost assume that this process of disclosure scaffolding has taken place. So you've started off with less risky, more vanilla sexual fantasies, acted them out, introduced those to the relationship. And then over time, they may build on themselves. You might kind of introduce new aspects. You might introduce another partner. Or opening up the relationship or something that's kind of present in a lot of those undisclosed fantasies. And because you have these kind of almost category of previous disclosure experiences that have presumably been very positive, you can kind of disclose with a lot more certainty because you can reflect and say, well, previously I told them about this. They responded very positively. So actually, it's likely they're going to respond in the same way, even if that's not something that they want to try.
Yeah. And I think what you're saying there makes a pretty good case for why it's good early on in a relationship to mix it up and experiment and try different things and cultivate this sense of novelty and curiosity within your sexual relationship. Because to the extent that you're used to trying new and different things with your partner, that makes it a lot easier down the road to share things like fantasies and desires to try out other things that you've never done previously. So that just sort of general novelty seeking level in your relationship can be really powerful in terms of just making it easier to disclose fantasies down the road. When I was younger, I could fall asleep just about anywhere and still bounce back the next day. I could even sleep on the floor and wake up feeling totally fine. But those days are long gone. I need to be really comfortable in order to get good quality sleep. Otherwise, the next day is just going to be a hot mess. So when I realized that my old mattress just wasn't keeping up with me anymore, I knew that I had to make a change. And that's when I switched to Brooklyn bedding. It has been a total reset for my sleep. I wake up feeling good and mentally sharp, and I don't need to grab a coffee before I let my partner talk to me, which is good for our relationship. Brooklyn Bedding handcrafts each and every mattress right here in the USA, and they have a mattress for every body and sleep style so that you can find one that's just right for you. Take their sleep quiz and find your perfect match in minutes. Awarded Best Mattress by CNET and Best Hybrid Mattress by Wirecutter, Brooklyn Bedding is the real deal. Go to brooklynbedding.com and use my promo code Justin at checkout to get 30% off site-wide. This offer is not available anywhere else. That's brooklynbedding.com and promo code Justin for 30% off site-wide. Make sure you enter our show name after checkout so that they know we sent you. brooklynbedding.com, promo code Justin. Let's talk about relationship satisfaction. One of the things that you found in your study that was kind of surprising to me was that being less satisfied in your relationship was linked to a greater likelihood of someone saying that they would share a fantasy in the future. And you might be tempted to think that people who are happier in their relationships would be more inclined to share simply because they feel safer and more secure. So why is that? Why do people who were less happy in their relationship, why were they saying they were more inclined to share their fantasies?
I was very much similar to you. So I kind of went into kind of planning the study with this idea that relationship satisfaction would be this positive predictor. And in study one, so that we talked about in the last episode, a few participants had mentioned or kind of shared that they had disclosed because they were dissatisfied in their relationship. And actually, that meant they were less concerned about their partner responding negatively, or that was their kind of approach to bringing about change. So they were dissatisfied sexually. So they were suggesting a sexual fantasy as this way to kind of almost inform their partner of aspects that they liked sexually versus those that they disliked. But we weren't quite expecting it to be this kind of negative predictor within this wider scale-based study. But having a look at the data, what we found is that the fantasies that relationship satisfaction was a negative predictor of were those involving multiple partners, those involving elements of power, control, or rough sex, those involving erotic flexibility, and the likelihood of disclosing a fantasy that's currently undisclosed. So I guess with these, what we can almost presume is that they're all fantasies that may pose a risk to the relationship. So sharing fantasies about other partners, particularly if the current partner isn't involved in those fantasies, could trigger conflict. The fantasies that were currently undisclosed, they also, those that were most commonly cited within that were fantasies involving multiple partners. Very similarly, elements of power and control was they may be very common in a lot of relationships. If they're not already present within the relationship, it can be a big jump to bring those in and kind of a big change to the sexual scripts. So I guess with the fantasies that it was a negative predictor of, they were all sexual acts that potentially differed from the kind of existing sexual relationship, which then kind of brought in this level of uncertainty. And I guess in those cases, actually, if you're very satisfied in the relationship, but you have this fantasy that's very different to what you currently are doing with your partner, you may avoid sharing that fantasy because actually the risks associated with doing so, so the potential for conflict or the potential of the relationship ending, outweigh the benefits of trying out the fantasy. So being able to try out that threesome or being able to experiment with flogging. Whereas for those who were unhappy in their relationship or where dissatisfaction was higher, actually it changed the balance a little bit. So whereas before the risks outweighed the rewards, in relationships that were characterized by dissatisfaction, the risks may not have that same impact. So you may be already experiencing relationship uncertainty, kind of considering whether to remain in a relationship. So like those participants who were kind enough to share their reasons for sharing or not sharing a sexual fantasy, they may be doing so to kind of bring about change, to try to save the relationship as kind of an approach to inform their partner of what they kind of like or dislike.
Yeah, and that totally makes sense. That the stakes for sharing a fantasy are going to be different depending upon whether you're in a highly satisfying or dissatisfying relationship. If the relationship, generally speaking, is already going really well and you're pretty happy and content in it, well, bringing up a fantasy that it turns out your partner isn't into could be riskier, right? Because you don't want to disrupt that balance and positivity and all the good things that you have going on in the relationship. And by contrast, if you're in a dissatisfying relationship, well, on the one hand, how can things get any worse, right? So you might see it as being less risky to share a fantasy in that case because maybe it is potentially a chance to save the relationship. But As I've said many times before, sharing a fantasy to try and save a relationship sometimes doesn't work out that well because you have to look at the reasons why you're dissatisfied in the first place. And if you're dissatisfied because you don't have good sexual communication and there are trust and intimacy issues in the relationship, well, sharing a fantasy isn't going to fix all of those things, right? So again, this goes back to, generally speaking, you probably want to work on the relationship a little bit first before you get into sharing fantasies with a partner, because there's a lot of potential for things to go wrong there. Now, you also looked at how relationship duration is linked to the sharing of sexual fantasies. And this is one of those factors that I think it's easy to potentially see it going in both directions. So on one hand, being in a longer term relationship might make it easier to share a fantasy because you have more comfort and stability with your partner. But by the same token, it also changes the stakes again when it comes to sharing fantasies. It could be risky to bring up something new and different and reveal a sexual incompatibility. So how is the length of the relationship related to whether or not you shared or withheld a fantasy?
Very similar to what you were just saying, actually. So, relationship duration was one that was kind of inconsistent in terms of direction. So, whether someone had actually shared a sexual fantasy or not was positively predicted by relationship duration. So, as the relationship continued, people were more likely to have shared a sexual fantasy at some point, which I guess makes sense because if you've been in a relationship perhaps for 40 years, that's 40 years in which you can share a sexual fantasy regardless of content, even if that's something very mild or very low risk. Whereas for the disclosure of a hypothetical sexual fantasy focusing on elements of power exchange or pain exchange, relationship duration was a negative predictor. So as the relationship duration increased, people became less likely to share new fantasies around this kind of exchange of power or pain, which again kind of links very nicely to that idea of relationship scripts. So we think of them in terms of establishing quite early on in the relationship or still being movable and still being changeable. But once you can introduce something that's similar or relationship script adjacent with very little risk because you can relate it to something that you've already tried with your partner, actually, if it's something that's completely different or you may not know what your partner's thoughts are or it's not something you've previously discussed, actually this might lead to avoiding disclosing based on this uncertainty, this kind of difference from kind of established sexual behavior with partners.
So relationship duration really does go both ways. And it does, to some extent, make it easier to share certain fantasies. But paradoxically, at the same time, it also makes it hard to share other types of fantasies because, as you said, if you kind of get into an established script or pattern with your partner, it can be hard to break free or deviate from that if the fantasy that you're talking about is something that would be just totally radically different from what it is that you've ever done with your partner before. Now, another surprising thing that emerged in your study was that trust was not a significant predictor of fantasy disclosure. And intuitively, you'd probably assume that high levels of trust would increase the odds of sharing a fantasy, but that wasn't the case here. So I was wondering if you had any thoughts on why trust didn't seem to be a key driver of disclosure.
Again, it was something that was kind of very surprising to us. So in qualitative response, when participants are asked for their reasons for sharing a sexual fantasy, actually quite a few participants within the relationship traits category indicated, I shared this because I trust my partner, I'm certain they'll respond positively, there's kind of high levels of trust within the relationship. But actually, when we used this quantitatively, it wasn't significant, which was a very big surprise to us and kind of led to a lot of evenings trying to figure out what this actually meant. One potential reason for this could be down to the type of trust that we're kind of looking at. So we use the Rempel Trust Scale, which is a general measure of trust within relationships. And actually, whilst general trust, so trusting your partner in general, might have very little influence on disclosure, it might be very different if you look at more specific forms of trust. So sexual trust or relational trust, for example. So I guess it's this kind of idea that actually is very much dependent on the type of trust that you're looking at. So what we're hoping to do in the future is look at this in a lot more detail and specifically focus on different types of trust to kind of re-examine this relationship and how this plays a role in disclosure.
I think it's interesting because we tend to think about trust as being kind of like just this one thing, but no, there's actually a lot of different types of trust you can have in your relationship. Like maybe you trust your partner financially, and maybe you trust your partner to keep your secrets, but maybe you don't trust them sexually, when it comes to your boundaries. And so all of these things could kind of influence what it is that you decide to share or do in your relationship. So yeah, I'd definitely be curious to see what happens in the future if you look at different kinds of trust in the relationship. So, one more question for you. You've researched pretty extensively this topic of fantasy disclosure. So, do you have any other tips or advice based on your research or any reading in this area in terms of how we can make it easier to share our fantasies with our partners, or anything that we can do to increase the odds of a positive experience when it comes to sharing sexual fantasies?
Absolutely. So I think there's a few different strategies that have come up based primarily on the qualitative responses. So the first being that idea that we've touched on a few times of building up to different disclosures. So if you have a fantasy that actually you're not certain how your partner will respond, is kind of very different to kind of your current sexual relationship, almost building up to it, taking that moment to kind of scaffold it. So start off with still on the same trains, the same kind of continent, but working up based on kind of the perceived risk, starting off with more vanilla forms of that fantasy and then kind of working up to almost see how your partner's likely to respond. I think the other thing that's kind of really important, particularly if it's something where you're not certain how your partner will respond, is having that distance from kind of sexual environments. So not kind of disclosing it partway through sex or in the bedroom, because this poses that risk to your partner where actually they may then feel that you're expecting them to try that out immediately. They don't have time to think on that or to kind of make their mind up. Actually, whilst it's the fantasy you're experiencing might not be something that they see very negatively, it might just be something that they've never thought of or it's never come to mind or they've never experienced before. So actually having that distance, so having that more neutral location takes away the pressure of potentially immediately having to act out the fantasy, but also then gives them that space to kind of respond positively, like we said in the last episode, to say, thank you for sharing. I really appreciate you trusting me with this. Ending the conversation, going away, researching, seeing actually what does this involve? Is it something I'm interested in? Maybe experimenting with porn and kind of seeing if it is something that's appealing. And then coming back to your partner and saying, actually, I've looked into this. I've had a look to see if this is something I'm interested in. Yes, I'd be interested in trying it. Or yes, I'd be interested in trying it, but under these conditions, or with the use of a safe word, or a caveat that we can end if I'm not enjoying it, or I'm not interested in this, but how about we try this instead? That's a compromise or in the way, something that I would be interested in trying. And I think the other is technology can help. So there's some really interesting research that focuses on the communication of kink and kind of the navigating scenes. And actually, text-based communication could take away a lot of the risk. Having that person in front of you can sometimes be quite threatening. Whereas if you're just kind of typing to a screen, actually, it can take a lot of the pressure off. And it can also kind of give that distance for both yourself and your partner to kind of take that time, respond in a way that takes away that potentially initial shock or in navigating that or thinking about how your partner will respond to a message. And there's also an online quiz that you can do that both you and your partner do this quiz and then you put your emails in and it shares the results, but only those that are mutually liked. And that was mentioned by a participant in the first study as kind of something that they found helpful for almost sharing everything, but only actually their partner hearing the bits that they want to hear, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you can absolutely leverage technology to make it easier to share fantasies. And the nice thing about it is that it can make it a little bit safer if you're using an app like Own Your Sex or X Confessions. Both of these are kind of like Tinder for sexual fantasies, where, you just each take a quiz separately, and then it links your results, and it only shares the things that are mutual interests. So in that way, you don't risk sharing something that your partner isn't into, and then don't potentially end up in a situation where there's some conflict or tension around that. So lots of different ways that you can go here. And sometimes technology can be your friend when it comes to sharing fantasies. So thank you so much for this amazing conversation, Matt. It was a pleasure to have you here. Can you please tell my listeners where they can go to learn more about you and your work?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm on X and Blue Sky at MLKimberly99. There's also the Gender, Sexuality and Intimate Relationships Research Lab at Birmingham City University, where we have kind of the web page and you can kind of see publications that are coming out. Also, feel free just to drop me an email if you're kind of interested in hearing more or potentially collaborating.
Well, great. And I will be sure to include links to all of that in the show notes. So thank you again so much for your time. I really appreciate having you here.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening. To keep up with new episodes of this podcast, visit my website, Sex and Psychology, at sexandpsychology.com, or subscribe on your favorite platform, where I hope you'll take a moment to rate and review the show. If you listen on Apple Podcasts, please consider becoming a Sex and Psychology Premium subscriber to enjoy ad-free listening for just $3.99 a month. You can also follow me on social media for daily sex research updates. I'm on Blue Sky and X at Justin Lehmiller and Instagram at Justin J. Lehmiller. Also, be sure to check out my book, Tell Me What You Want. Thanks again for listening. Until next time.